Good evening to everybody. Please turn your Bibles to Job chapter 3. Job chapter 3 as we begin our study of God's Word. And studying God's Word is a very important, crucial part of the spiritual growth process. Worship God, study His Word, love one another, and reach the lost. If you're wondering where Brian is, normally this would be his turn. He is in Claremont, and they're having a special series on Wednesdays. So I'll be there next Wednesday, Lord willing. But next Wednesday is also singing. But Brian is in Claremont tonight. My mom and dad are here with me, Pam and Tony. And so make sure you get a chance to meet them. They're going to be spending a couple of days with me and my family, so I'm excited about that. On Sunday, Brian introduced wisdom literature in the Old Testament, and he launched into the book of Job, and we covered the first 2 chapters of Job on Sunday. And so tonight what we're going to be trying to cover, if I get through all that I've planned, is Job chapters 3 through 8. Of course, this is in our overall study of the United Kingdom. Why are we studying Job as we're studying the United Kingdom? Why would we study Job in a study of the United Kingdom? Did his story take place during the United Kingdom? No. When did his story take place? Patriarchal period. You look at the fact that he offered sacrifices in the style of like Abraham.
Because of the literature with Solomon.
Yes. So his story took place way back in the time of like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. You also look at the length of his life. He had 10 full-grown children at the beginning of the story. So let's say he was maybe 60. At the end of the story, he lives 140 more years. Okay, so you put 140 with about 60, if that's how old he was, we don't know. That's about 200 years. Well, remember, Abraham lived to be 175. And Isaac lived to be 180. And so that was the age that people were living more commonly back then, but certainly not during the United Kingdom. But as Herb said, the story of Job fits in the wisdom literature, which was written during the United Kingdom period, and probably in the time of Solomon was when the story of Job was actually recorded. So that's why we're studying it. And we're going to try to cover these several chapters, 3 through 8. Let's quickly look at an outline of the book to get this before us. So the first 2 chapters are where Satan challenges God and Job loses everything, and he still remains faithful to God. And then in chapters 3 through 31, we have a series of 3 rounds of speeches. So Job has 3 friends, and what were their names? Okay, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. All right, good. And so what would happen is they would speak in that order. So it starts with Job in chapter 3. He laments his condition. And then Eliphaz responds. Then Job responds to Eliphaz. Then there's Bildad. Then Job responds. And then there's Zophar, and Job responds. That's the first round. Then they go for round 2. And same basic order, right? So it's Eliphaz, then Job, then Bildad, then Job, then Zophar, then Job. Third round, same order, except for Zophar does not speak on the third round. And then, after all of those speeches are over, there was another friend who was waiting in the wing who speaks up and basically puts all of them in their place, Job included. And what was his name? All right, Elihu or Elihu, however you want to pronounce that, 32 through 37. And then after that, God speaks. And he challenges Job and really rebukes Job. Chapter 38 through chapter 42, verse 6. Then the very end of the book is Job is vindicated. So that's the layout of the book. So what we're going to be doing tonight and for the next couple of classes is we're going to be looking at these speeches of Job and his 3 friends. So we'll launch into the first round. We'll get about halfway through the first round of the 3 rounds of speeches. Okay? So we'll start here in chapter 3 with Job's lament. And he is lamenting the fact that he was ever born in the first place. He says in verses 1 through 4, or it says, afterward Job opened his mouth. By the way, when it says afterward, that means after the 7 days where Job and his friends that came to comfort him just sit. Just imagine, nobody's saying anything. They don't know what to say. And they just sit, and nobody's saying anything. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, Job starts talking. So can you imagine kind of being there and your ears perk up and you're ready to listen to what Job has to say? And it says, afterward Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, let the day perish on which I was to be born, and the night which said a boy is conceived. May that day be darkness. Let not God above care for it, nor light shine on it. Let darkness and black gloom claim it. Let a cloud settle on it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. And it's just so depressing as he goes on to just talk about, why didn't I die at birth? As he progresses in this speech in verses 13 through 19, he talks about the fact that it'd be better to be dead. Because why?
We'd have had all this suffering.
Then I'll be at rest. If I was dead, at least I'd be at rest. And he then ends his speech with talking about kind of the futility of being alive if you're only alive to suffer. Like, what's the point of being alive if all you're going to do is suffer? For example, look at this long question he asks in verses 20 through 22. He says, why is light given to him who suffers, and life to the bitter of soul? Who long for death, but there is none. Who dig for it more than for hidden treasures. Who rejoice greatly and exult when they find the grave. There may be some people who can relate to that. Who kind of have felt in life at times, life is so hard, and I'm suffering so much. What is the point? What's the point of being alive? And of course, suicide rates have just increased and increased over the past decade. It's insane how much they've increased. The interesting thing is, when Job contemplates death, he never contemplates suicide. He never once in this book contemplates suicide. That's not an option even on the table at all. But you just don't get more depressed than wishing you're never born. But I know that Christians struggle with that, because I've preached on this in a place and a lady came up afterwards. She said, I've wished that before. And I bet there probably are several who could say, I've thought that same thing before. So we can kind of relate a little bit, just a little bit, to how Job was feeling here. And I want to remind you of something I said on Sunday. And that is that it's not a sin to be depressed. It's not a sin to be down. It can become sinful if you let that overtake you and lead you in the wrong direction. But Job was depressed. Was he sinning here? He wasn't sinning. He was pouring his heart out to God. Now, we could look at all these things he said and try to decide what we would say. I just want you to just appreciate what he said and realize that probably the best thing his friends could have done is just kept sitting and been there for him and put their arm around him. But the moment they start opening their mouths, they ruin it. It all goes downhill. So let's just appreciate the level of suffering that he's enduring here and try to have compassion for that and think, how could I respond to that? One of the things we learn from his three friends is how not to respond to suffering. That's one of the greatest lessons in the book. Here's how you don't respond to suffering in the way that Job's three friends did. Yeah.
Do you think that Job never had suicide on the table because he knew that was not what God would want? That in his mind that just wasn't even an option?
Sure.
Simply because he knew that was not what God would want.
I believe that would be the case. I cannot prove that to you, but
right.
I believe that would certainly be the case. Yeah. Okay, any other thoughts or questions before we move forward? All right, that's good because I got a lot to cover. So Job is followed by Eliphaz. So Eliphaz speaks up in chapters 4 and 5. And I want to just read these first 5 verses here. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered, "If one ventures a word with you, will you become impatient? But who can refrain from speaking? Behold, you have admonished many, and you have strengthened weak hands. Your words have helped the tottering to stand, and you have strengthened feeble knees. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed." I find it a little ironic that he's calling Job impatient. Of all of the people in the Bible that were patient, he's calling Job impatient. He starts off kind of gentle, actually, compared. But of all the things he could have said to this man who is hurting deeper than anybody could hurt, and he's basically saying, well, you need to practice what you're preaching, Job. You're not practicing what you preach to others who suffer, because you're not handling suffering the way that you tell people they need to handle suffering. And he continues, and he gives his basic theological position, which is the same position the other 2 friends have, and that is this: the innocent do not suffer. Whoever perished being innocent. And look at what he says in chapter 4 and verse 8. "According to what I have seen, those who plow iniquity and those who sow trouble harvest it." Well, is that generally true? You sow what you reap? You reap what you sow? Yeah, I mean, didn't Paul say that in Galatians? Galatians 6, verse 7, "Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, this he will also reap." So what is this mistake that Eliphaz is making in really using that concept to apply to Job's situation? What's wrong with it? Sorry?
Job hasn't sinned.
Okay. He hasn't sinned in such a way as to deserve this. Right, Miss B?
Well, he's making it specific when that's a generalization.
Very good. So what Eliphaz does is he overgeneralizes this concept as if it applies in all situations all the time. So those were really good answers that you guys just gave. There are exceptions to the principle that you reap what you sow. And Job was one of them. Not every bad thing that happens is a result of sin that was accomplished. Didn't the Jews in Jesus' day, even his own apostles, have this same misconception? You remember in John 9, when Jesus and his apostles were leaving the temple area, and it says as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind?" You see, they automatically assumed, not knowing anything, except for this man is blind. He must have sinned. Somebody must have sinned. What did Jesus say to him? Neither that man nor his parents sinned. This happened so that God might be glorified. So that misconception is something that has stretched through centuries, right? And people today even sometimes have that. When you're suffering, you might just say, well, what did I do to deserve this? And you automatically assume you did something wrong, and that's why you're suffering. It goes back to the same basic misconception that is going on here. One cannot tell by looking at a person's circumstances whether he is righteous or wicked. You cannot tell by looking at circumstances. So Eliphaz then talks about this dream he had. And what he says is he had this dream where he saw what? He saw a spirit. Scared him. And the spirit started talking to him. And the essence of what the spirit said, for sake of time, just look at verse 17, chapter 4. "Can mankind be just before God? Can a man be pure before his Maker?" And the point that the spirit was making is, no, mankind cannot be just because mankind is full of imperfections. But how would you answer that question if someone asked you, can mankind be just before his Maker?
Can be justified, yes.
Can be justified.
In only one way.
Right. We have to be forgiven. We have to be forgiven, and we can be be just. And so that, that actually was not true. It was just a vague generalization that didn't deal with the reality of a situation. Did Job claim to be perfect? He never claims to be sinlessly perfect in the book. And yet they treat him as if that's what he's claiming. So they start making assumptions and making false accusations as we continue. In chapter 5, 1 through 7, Eliphaz talks about the state of the foolish. He says, I've seen the way foolish people live and their children. Their lives are a train wreck. Like, that's just how it is, black and white. And look at what he says in verses 6 and 7 of chapter 5. He says, for affliction does not come from the dust, nor does trouble sprout from the ground. For man is born for trouble as sparks fly upward. See what he's saying? He's saying, Job, your suffering didn't come out of nowhere. There had to be something to cause your suffering. Little did he know, the thing that did cause his suffering was actually his righteousness. And Satan challenging God. And God allowing Satan to afflict Job to test Job's righteousness. That was actually what caused it. But does all suffering have to have some cause? Doesn't Ecclesiastes 3 tell us that the race is not to the swift? It makes the point that time and chance happen to them all. God has worked in time and chance into the warp and the woof of this creation. It's part of this world that we live in. So, again, Eliphaz has it wrong here. And he says next, you just need to seek God. That's what I would do. That's what I would do. God is mighty, and He can deliver you. And I just find it interesting in verse 13, if you want to look at that verse, where he says he captures the wise by their own shrewdness. It seems that Paul quotes this in 1 Corinthians 3. I'll show you the passage up here on the screen. 1 Corinthians 3:19, Paul says, for the wisdom of this world is foolishness before God, for it is written, He is the one who catches the wise in their craftiness. If that's not a quotation of this verse in Job chapter 5, I don't know what it's a quotation of. If it is a quotation of that, that's really interesting to me. Because who said it? Eliphaz. Was Eliphaz inspired by the Holy Spirit? No. He said a lot of things that were wrong. But the fact that Paul quotes from him shows that not everything that Eliphaz says was wrong. Was there some truth? Was there a kernel of truth in a lot of things that Eliphaz says? Well, sure. That's what makes false doctrine so tricky. That's why it's so deceptive. It's not like it's false from beginning to end. There are elements of truth embedded within it. And so it's okay for us to agree with those individual truths. Paul agrees with this truth that was stated by Eliphaz. But overall, these truths were not properly applied. And thus they wound up coming out to a false conclusion. I'll make a couple more comments, then I'll open up for you to make comments. He ends his speech talking about the benefits of God's discipline. Look at verse 17, chapter 5. He says, behold how happy is the man whom God reproves. So do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. Now what's he basically saying to Job there? What's he assuming about Job? You're being disciplined in the sense of being punished. Being punished. You're being punished. Was that what was going on with Job? Was he being punished? No. Now, this concept, do not despise the discipline of the Almighty, is that a good concept?
No, it's a good concept.
Do we find that in Hebrews 12? Not taking lightly the discipline of the Lord and letting that develop us and grow us. But He doesn't apply it properly. And so that, wisdom is taking truth and rightly applying it to each situation. That's wisdom. So Eliphaz is showing that he has some knowledge of some moralisms and platitudes, but he does not have the wisdom to rightly apply that in a real life situation. And that's really where the rubber meets the road. I like how I don't like how he ends, but look in verse 27. He says, "Behold this, we have investigated it, and so it is. Hear it, and know for yourself." What's he saying there?
Apply it to yourself.
We've got it figured out, Job. We're here to impart knowledge to you, and you need to listen to us. If you come in with that attitude in any argument, are you going to learn? Are you going to get very far? What kind of attitude do you have to go into any kind of confrontation or argument?
Searching for truth.
That's right. A willingness even to admit fault. A willingness to listen, even if you disagree with the other side. And that's one thing that his friends do not do. There's really an attitude of arrogance that is behind their unwillingness to change or to listen to anything Job says. So, to summarize the speech, here's basically what Eliphaz said in short. Job, you should not be impatient. Sin is the cause of your suffering. Receive God's discipline and seek Him, and you will be blessed. Sounds good on the surface. It would have applied to the right person, but it did not apply to Job's situation at all. So 2 flaws. Number 1, it didn't apply to Job because he hadn't sinned so as to deserve his suffering. And secondly, it defined God's blessings as merely material benefits that serve a fleshly purpose. And that's what we're going to see ad nauseum with these 3 friends. They don't see anything past the material, the physical, the earthly. Okay. So any comments or questions before we move forward? Jason?
I think one of the unique things that we have as human beings, we always want to lie. Prosecutors in criminal trials, even if they know who did a crime, they want to show motive. They want to show why. They want to give a reason why, because juries are sold on the why. And that, I think, is the main issue they're contending with. And Job's contending with it. He wants to know why. Why it's all that's happening to me. And they have made their decision that it's this reason. We know because we're privy to some things that Job and they weren't, that it was due to God's faith in him, basically,
Right.
and his own righteousness.
Yeah.
That God trusted Job to be faithful to him,
Right.
despite a lack of blessing.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And we need to, because we're all that way. I mean, it's a natural human tendency about the why. We need to be careful with that.
Yeah.
In terms of why somebody does something, why something happened to somebody. We may not know. And we may be putting ourselves in the position of Job's friends here as to, with all arrogance and confidence, saying, well, we know why this is so.
Yes.
And we render judgment against our brothers and sisters in tremendous error, in terrible error. And we add to the burden that they're bearing. And I think the other thing is, and you're going to discuss it more fully, obviously, is I think it demonstrates a complete misunderstanding of the nature of God and how He blesses His servants.
Yeah, it's a very transactional mindset. We'll talk more about that. Okay, good. I can't really add anything to that, Jason. That was well said, and I think that really is the core of their disagreement is over the why issue. And very, very good. Gail, and then Joe.
I think it's also important that you know that Job had complete faith in God, because it's a lesson to us not to put so much stock in our friends that they can let us down, but God won't.
That's a great point. He was really hoping his friends would help him. And he's going to talk about that later. But yeah, put our trust where it really counts. And even, you can't even trust ultimately in your spouse as being the source of your, well-being and so forth. You ultimately can only really put that trust in God and know that it will always be there. Good. Anything else? Joe, yeah, you had something, didn't you?
I was just thinking of why. I mean, the friends were assuming stuff that they could have never known. And I think, like, they were assuming, well, you have sinned. You need to assume the good of a Christian,
Right.
brother and sister.
Great point.
Until you're absolutely, unequivocally
That's right.
proven wrong.
Yeah,
Because otherwise, I mean, why are we sitting here trusting each other?
right.
And then I think the second thing is, if we don't know why, all we need to have is belief that God knows.
Right.
God knows why.
Amen.
Because we don't know.
Right.
Makes no difference.
Jesus said, judge with righteous judgment.
Yes.
And,
That's through God.
That's right. And so these men were not judging with righteous judgment. They were jumping to conclusions, and they had no proof for the things they were saying at all. So let's move now into Job's answer to Eliphaz in chapters 6 and 7. He starts out saying, I have a right to complain. You cannot even imagine how much I'm suffering here. And he says in verses 8 through 13, I just want to read 8 through 10. He says, oh, that my request might come to pass, and that God would grant my longing. Would that God were willing to crush me, that He would loose His hand and just cut me off. So he's longing for death. He's not contemplating it himself, doing it, but he's basically just asking God, can't you just kill me? But look at verse 10. This is so beautiful. But it is still my consolation, and I rejoice in unsparing pain that I have not denied the words of the Holy One. I think that's such an amazing verse, because this is actually Job talking about joy. Where is he finding that joy?
In the Lord.
That's right.
Taking his life. Not that he cannot.
Well, it's after he says that, actually, that he's saying, here's what I take joy in, that yes, I'm suffering terribly, but I have not departed from my God. Like, if that's all you can take pleasure in your unsparing pain, take pleasure in that, in knowing that you have not forsaken your God. Then he talks about how undependable his friends are in verses 14 through 23. And he calls them like a wadi, a brook that has dried up in the summertime. When travelers are coming along in their caravans and they come up to this water where they're expecting to be water, and it's gone. He's saying, that's what you friends are like. I was expecting you to help me, and you've totally disappointed me. And then he says, have I asked you for wealth? Have I asked you for something? Why are you even here? I'm not asking of you anything. And then in verses 24 through 30, he challenges them, and this goes to what Joe was just talking about. He says, show me my sin. Look in verses 24 and 25. He says, teach me and I will be silent, and show me how I have erred. How painful are honest words, but what does your argument prove? They had no evidence. What was their evidence that Job had sinned?
Zero.
Why did they assume Job had sinned?
Calamity.
Because he was suffering. And their theology demanded that then they assumed that he must have sinned to deserve that suffering. Well, that's bad theology. That's bad doctrine that leads you to that point. And I love the point that Joe made. If we are to assume anything about somebody, we're talking with a Christian and everything, we need to first assume the best. Don't immediately assume the worst. And that's what they do right out of the gate. Job then describes how helpless his condition is in chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. He says, my life is so miserable that all I really have to look forward to sometimes is at least being able to lay down and go to sleep. But all I do when I lay down to go to sleep is I just toss. And I can't even sleep. And I want to focus on what he says in verse 6, chapter 7 and verse 6. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle, and come to an end without hope. Any of y'all know, I had to look up a YouTube video. I was like, what does that really look like? And it's quick, and they're just passing that thing back and forth, and they're going to town. And he's saying my life is quicker than that. It's over. And what he's basically saying there is he would like for him to have the chance to enjoy life again. But he knows that his life is just going to be over, and he's going to have no chance for ever being happy again. That's how he feels. And I mentioned on Sunday that at the end of the book, Job receives back twofold all of his blessings. But he doesn't know that right now. He is, in his mind, he is prepared to spend the rest of his life in absolute misery, but still remain faithful to God. That's the commitment that he has to his Lord. And to do it totally confused about why all this was happening. But he was going to stay faithful to his God. Well, he ends his speech. I'll open up for comments in just a second. Protesting God's treatment of him. And I just really want to focus on verses 19 through 21. We have to cherry pick certain things just because we have so much material. But look there, starting verse 19, he says to God, "Will you never turn your gaze away from me, nor let me alone until I swallow my spittle? Have I sinned? What have I done to you, O watcher of men? Why have you set me as your target, so that I am a burden to myself? Why then do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? For now I will lie down in the dust, and you will seek me, but I will not be." Job is starting to tread into dangerous waters now, because he is starting to question God's motives. He's starting to question really why God was turning into his enemy. When if he knew the real picture, he wouldn't ask that. He wouldn't have those doubts about God. And he would see that God had a very good reason for doing what he was doing. And so what I'm saying is we need to be very careful, because we don't have full knowledge, not to assume my suffering means God is out to get me. God, why are you out to get me? Well, did you just assume that God was out to get you? Yes, I assumed that. So maybe that'll change your view a little bit. We can understand Job's attitude. But what we ought to do whenever we're suffering and it doesn't make sense to us is just, number one, accept the fact that whatever God's role in this was, He's righteous and He had a good reason for doing it. I don't understand what that reason is. I want to know, but that's okay. I know that God is righteous and just. And therefore, I'm not going to question His judgment. Because the reason I say this is dangerous territory is this is what Job gets in trouble for later. The main lesson that Job learns in the book is I cannot demand an answer to the why question. Because God reveals to us what He reveals to us. But the secret things belong to the Lord. Deuteronomy 29:29. There are things we will never know. And we will drive ourselves crazy demanding an answer to some things that God has never revealed. You'll drive yourself nuts. And it can turn you bitter. And so it's pointless. So to summarize Job's speech, he's saying, my complaint is justifiable, and you three are no help, like I'd hoped. I am absolutely miserable and confused. You feel bad for him. Does anybody want to make any comments or questions at this point before we move forward? Vanessa, then Jason?
It's a long time to go on, too. You
Yeah.
made the comment, right now, this is going to be the rest of his life. And
Right.
You said, by all rights, he's still a young man. It's
Yeah,
not like he's an
right.
old man about to die.
Right.
He's still a young man. He has a long way to go.
That's right.
And he has nobody. and
Yeah.
no friends. And
Right.
at that time, God wasn't talking to him,
Yeah.
and I can't, yeah.
And so I feel sort of strange just to criticize Job at all. The only reason I feel like I can be any critical of Job is because God is later critical of Job. But you just, your heart goes out to the poor guy, what he's going through here. Jason?
I think you can see too that the problem with his friends is kind of what led to some of his later problems in his discussion with God, because his friends led him to a position where he had to be defensive and almost arrogant about, I am righteous. I have been serving God. And that leads us to, okay, God, I've just settled this with my friends. I have been righteous. I have been serving you. What's going on?
Yeah.
And I'm glad you said the problem, what he got in trouble for, was demanding the answer. God has never told us that we can't ask the questions. It's when we demand the answer,
Yes.
or we attempt to call God into account, which he was essentially doing.
Yes.
Okay, God, account for yourself.
Yeah. He's going to do that more later.
Yourself
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah.
And so we don't need to be afraid to cry out to God and to ask those questions.
Right.
But we need to understand that he may not always answer us, or at least may not answer us in the way that we hope.
Right. Yeah. I think you clarified that really well, and it's a progression throughout the book that he becomes more and more bold about demanding this answer to the why question. Again, there's nothing wrong with asking it, but it's when we're demanding of it, of something that we can never know, that it really is not healthy. It's not good. Very good. Any other comments, Joe?
You just need to be careful who you listen to. They kept telling you sin, and now here, chapter 7 or 8 here, where we were, and now he's now saying, have I sinned?
Mm-hmm.
So he's beginning to believe what they say.
Okay, that's
Be very careful.
interesting to think of.
You gotta be very careful who you listen to.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay. Let's move forward now to chapter 8 and look at the second of the friends that speaks up. This will be as far as we get. Bildad speaks up, and he's a little bit more bold in what he says. I want to read the first 7 verses. Then Bildad the Shuhite answered, "How long will you say these things, and the words of your mouth be a mighty wind? Does God pervert justice, or does the Almighty pervert what is right? If your sons sinned against him, then he delivered them into the power of their transgression." Now hold on a minute. Let's just pause. Ouch! What is he saying there in verse 4 about his sons? The ones that died? Job lost 10 children. Well, they died because they were wicked, and that was a judgment on them. Talk about, a huge jump to make. A big assumption to make. Unproven. He says in verse 5, "If you would seek God and implore the compassion of the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, surely now he would rouse himself for you and restore your righteous estate. Though your beginning was insignificant, yet your end will increase greatly." Well, he's kind of speaking for God here. He is saying, I know what God would do. Was he correct? No, because Job was pure and upright, and was God rousing himself and making the suffering stop? So he spoke as if he knew exactly what God would do. We need to be really careful. And I, as a preacher, have learned I have to be very careful. I don't want to speak of what I think God would do when I don't know. So where I go? I just go here and I read this and I say, that's what I know right there. I can tell you what I think, but I know this right here. And that's ultimately what we have to do. He then appeals to the wisdom of the ancients. Job, we don't know much. You need to go back and you need to listen to what the people before us have passed down. And then he gives some teachings of the ancients. Just these vague generalities like, can the papyrus grow where there is no marsh? Well, no. And so his point is, so are the paths of those who forget God. It's like a plant without roots in the ground. It's just going to wither and die. Well, okay. Does that help the situation? Does that apply to Job? No. And he just gives example after example like that. 3 specific metaphors that are just so vague and general. They have no application to Job's situation. And he ends with this word of optimistic hope. God will not reject a man of integrity. If you turn to God, He'll restore you. That's kind of the idea. Again, ironic, because Job was a man of incredible integrity. And it just did not apply to him. But I want to say this real quick at the end. I want to say something nice about Bildad. I think that he was sincere and he had good intentions. I think all of the friends had good intentions. They wanted to help Job. But they went about it in the wrong way. And so that's going to be all we're going to cover tonight. Please read Job chapters 9 through 17. Please read all of those chapters for Sunday and read through the beginning of page 148 in the book. Thanks.